Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about history of science and technology. And I see a bunch of questions saved up, including some long, complicated ones here. But I see a couple of questions about the history, one from Smiling. What is the history of game theory? What are some successful and less successful applications of the theory? I thought we talked about this recently. I'm trying to remember. And then there's another question from George. Can you speak about John Nash's work? Did that have any influence on your automata work? Let's see. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about game theory. I've never been a huge fan, although we just finally got around to introducing a very cleanly designed built-in game theory functionality for Wolfram language in the latest version 14.2. So that helped me to understand sort of what game theory is about, because it always helps to really get things clarified to the point where we can make a clean implementation. But history of game theory. Well, the study of kind of games as a mathematical idea is pretty old. Like the Bernoullis in the 1600s were inventing probability theory to try and figure out things about how games might work, how games of chance might work. But game theory, the thing by that name, kind of originated with John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in the 1940s, I guess. They're both in Princeton. Oscar Morgenstern was an economist. John von Neumann was a kind of mathematics person who I've studied quite a lot. He died in 1956, I think, before my time, obviously. But I've certainly talked to many people who knew him. John von Neumann was very much of a mathematicize everything and anything and do it quickly. He was very sort of sharp, quick fellow. And I think in some ways, his quickness may have not helped him because he did have a habit of figuring things out quick, but missing deeper points. So that happened to him with Gödel's theorem. He almost kind of figured out Gödel's theorem, but didn't quite. And as soon as he kind of heard what Gödel had to say, he was like, I got it. He got it very quickly. But he was working on those kinds of things about logic and didn't get Gödel's theorem. He also did a lot on the mathematical foundations of quantum mechanics in the 1930s, and I always think he sort of missed the point in the sense that he sort of just defined the mathematical structure where there's this idea of, and then you just measure things in quantum mechanics. And it's always been kind of measurement is sort of the mysterious kind of infrastructure of quantum mechanics that's never been properly unraveled. And I somewhat blame John von Neumann for having set up a mathematical formalism where measurement is sort of comes for granted in the formalism, and it led people to not really think hard about how to think about that part of what was going on from a physical point of view. And John von Neumann worked on many things. He worked on computers. He was ended up as a consultant working on with IBM and so on kind of how to set up kind of stored program computers. And he wrote, it's interesting to read what he wrote. I mean, he wrote a lot about the organs of computers. He had a very biological view of what was going on in computation. Actually, by organ, he meant what we would now call gate, like something that computes a single logic operation like and or something like that. Von Neumann also in the department of kind of slightly missing the point. When Alan Turing was a graduate student at Princeton, which he was after he'd done his 1936 paper on the universal Turing machine, sort of an anomaly, I would say, in the way that the academic systems of England and the US meshed, that, Alan Turing was sort of a bright young sort of doing research person in Cambridge, England, but sort of a step was to be a graduate student in Princeton to get an actual PhD, which not everybody in the English academic system did at that time. It was pretty common for people to go straight from an undergraduate degree to a college fellowship, which they could potentially hold for the rest of their lives, without ever getting that very sort of German-American idea of a doctorate. And in fact, when I was a kid, I knew many sort of academics in Oxford who were on the older side, who were sort of proudly Mr. So-and-so. They'd never got a PhD. PhDs were viewed as being sort of a slightly crass, kind of low-level sort of seeking letters after your name type thing, rather than the sort of pure, I'm just going to be an intellectual kind of thing of what you were doing, sort of in the process of getting your college degree and then having a college fellowship. That's all changed in subsequent years, but that's the way it was at that time. And for Alan Turing, it was sort of an extra goodie that he was going to go to the US and get a PhD, which he did along with working with Alonzo Church, writing some of probably his most obscure paper ever. But anyway, so he intersected with John von Neumann, who was in Princeton at that time as well. And but then later on, I don't remember quite the sequence of events, but John von Neumann had a reason to write a recommendation letter for Alan Turing. And famously, he said, Alan Turing has done good work on the central limit theorem in statistics. This was several years after Alan Turing's universal Turing machine paper. So von Neumann at the time really missed the significance of the Turing machine idea. In fact, von Neumann later on, as he was thinking about computers, started thinking about sort of computers in terms of brain-like things, and was very taken with the work that Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts had done in 1943, where they had sort of pulled in the Turing machine idea and connected it to kind of the neurophysiological idea of kind of wires for nerves connecting things. And von Neumann, through that, came to sort of have more interest in Alan Turing's work, and came not really in the end to use it in a serious way in thinking about design of computers, but did at least sort of pay lip service to it later on. But, von Neumann was also, he was famous for statements like, there'll never be a need for more than 5 computers in the United States, which, in modern times might turn into, well, you could have 5 supercomputer centers. Perhaps that's the kind of thing he was thinking of. Also, I think he had another thing, thinking that there would never be a need to have a program that was more than a couple of hundred lines long. And again, it was not, it sounds silly to us today. It wasn't quite as silly as it sounded, because what he was thinking of was, no single mathematical proof tends to be longer than that, or nobody can follow it. But he didn't have the idea of subroutines, of functions, subfunctions, and so on, which is how, one modularly builds up much more complicated programs and so on. He also, in an area close to things I've been interested in, was interested in sort of the mathematicization of biology, and the idea that one could have kind of a sort of a mathematical representation of the core of what was happening in biology, something I've been interested in actually quite recently. Well, this is now, when was it? This must have been 1940, what was it? Late 1940s, I think. Von Neumann, who had been trained actually as a chemical engineer before he went into mathematics and physics, trained as a chemical engineer in Hungary, where he came from, he had this idea that maybe one can think of a biological cell as being like a chemical factory with all these different things being produced and so on. It's not a completely silly idea, but then he wanted to sort of make that cleaner and more mathematical. And it turns out his friend Oscar Morgenstern, of whom we'll talk in a minute in connection with game theory, Oscar Morgenstern was von Neumann apparently was enjoyed hanging out with Oscar Morgenstern's quite young kids, who had these erector sets, kind of wooden block sets for constructing things. And somehow through that, he got the idea of forget the whole chemical factory. Let's just imagine making something out of more discrete kind of erector set components that could be a model of biological cells. And then actually another friend of von Neumann's, Stan Ulam, who I did know, who had been a Polish mathematician who came to the US and who was very much into sort of things combinatorial. And Stan Ulam had studied infinite matrices, and somehow through that suggested to John von Neumann that, well, forget the erector set. Why not just have this two-dimensional array? Forget 3 dimensions, forget kind of objects moving around robotically and so on. Just have this array of discrete cells. And that's how von Neumann came to think about two-dimensional cellular automata. He didn't yet call them cellular automata in connection with sort of models of biology. But again, he somewhat missed the point, because he assumed that to make things as complicated as happen in biology, you would have to have some very complicated set of rules. And he designed this thing with kind of, what was it, 28 states, I think, and a 29,000 cell configuration that could, by very engineering processes, reproduce itself. That became a book finished by a chap called Arthur Burks after von Neumann died. But anyway, that was so von Neumann had a long history of coming up with very interesting mathematicizations of things that maybe didn't quite hit the deeper point. So now we come to game theory. I don't know as much as I might about the full history of this, but von Neumann ended up working with Oscar Morgenstern to kind of make this theory of idealized games, where there would be sort of, everybody would have a certain payoff. You could represent it in terms of collections of matrices and things, and you could just sort of figure out what was how would you define, how would you see how rational folk could optimize their positions in terms of these various payoffs that they had. It's kind of an interesting idealization of the world. I'm not sure it's a correct idealization of the world, but it's an interesting idealization. And von Neumann and Morgenstern wrote a book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, I think, which was quite influential. This was, heading into the deep Cold War period, and von Neumann had been sort of a high-level consultant to the US government on lots of Cold War-ish types of things, with a lot of kind of clever ideas for sort of how to optimize the US's position. It's often claimed, I think correctly, that the Dr. Strangelove character in the Dr. Strangelove movie by Stanley Kubrick is based on John von Neumann. I don't know for sure if that's correct, but von Neumann certainly had ideas. I think this might have been one of his ideas of, you want to hide your missiles, well, have a big train track and just have the missiles on train cars, and they're always sort of circulating around the train track. And a little bit like you don't know where the submarine is, but this is a train track rather than a submarine. Sort of, the other side's not going to be able to hit your missiles because they don't know where they are on this 100-mile train track or something that's underground. So von Neumann was keen on those kinds of ideas, and game theory was certainly something, and I don't know the full details of this, that was sort of applied in thinking about kind of the game, in a sense, not really a game, but of sort of what the Soviet Union and the US should do with their whole collections of missiles and so on. And this kind of idea of mutually assured destruction, I think, was something of a spin-off of sort of game theory types of thinking. I think also the Rand Corporation, which was is still a think tank type place, had some connection with the sort of early days of game theory. I know von Neumann and Morgenstern actually started a company in Princeton that they briefly used the name Mathematica for. This was in the 1950s. And although that company disappeared, it got reborn subsequently, but it um, in that was supposed to be kind of a game theory consulting operation. Game theory was all these questions about sort of how do you optimize things and so on. John Nash was a graduate student in Princeton who ended up figuring out, let's not go into all the technical details of Nash equilibria and so on, but figured out some surprising and interesting things about games and sort of how to reach optima in games. Subsequently, unfortunately, John Nash kind of went rather off the deep end. And when I was in Princeton in the early 80s, you would quite often see kind of John Nash having walked around the math department and the physics department at Princeton, kind of presumably in the middle of the night, writing very strange things up on blackboards and so on. And a very kind of I think in his kind of life in science, he made a lot of connections that other people hadn't been able to make, but it sort of went out of control, and he was making sort of connections sort of all over everything about the way the world could be, which didn't make a lot of sense. Subsequently, he kind of recovered from all of that. He was actually quite a user of our Mathematica software product. I unfortunately never met him. He came to a number of our user conferences, but ones that I wasn't at. I did have occasion to see some of the code that he wrote in Wolfram language, which was definitely odd. I would say definitely on the very kind of procedural end of is actually one of the only people I've ever seen who used go-to statements in Wolfram language, which I had not even remembered we'd ever implemented. But in any case, that's but in terms of the sort of subsequent development of game theory and its uses, there's a whole sort of it's kind of a smooth transition from game theory to economic mechanism design and auction theory and so on. And a lot of that has been used plenty in thinking about, well, in practical auctions for ads on the web and lots of things with cryptocurrency and so on. And it's something of active interest. I mean, there have been a number of other cases. I know things like the Law of the Sea Treaty that involved sort of all these different countries and all these different interests and so on. So at least claimed that game theory was very useful for that. Also things like auctions of radio spectrum and so on, and how to do that. I can't speak to the sort of front lines of what's been done there, but that's the impression of what's happened. Sort of another branch of game theory, the kind of thing that von Neumann and Nash and so on worked on, is sort of this very static version of game theory, where it's just like you have these payoffs, and it's like, how do people optimize their position based on these particular payoffs? There's a more dynamic version in which you kind of have, let's say, multiple generations, and you're sort of trying something and you're going towards the optima over the course of many generations. A big application of that is in population genetics. A chap called John Maynard Smith, who I knew, was at least one of the leading lights in that business, and in trying to figure out things like, why would this particular species have this unusual ratio of males to females and so on? Well, it was based on some sort of payoff matrix in the kind of game theory thing. I'm not sure to what extent one should really talk about that as game theory, and to what extent it's just there are these differential equations or that govern kind of how much of the progression of how much of each species there would be, or how much of each gender there would be, or whatever, and that one is simply looking at the fixed point as one evolves those equations, rather than thinking about it as a sort of pure game theory play. And then there are other ideas about iterated games, particularly Bob Axelrod, who I've known for a while, is sort of famous for having looked at the iterated prisoner's dilemma and asking the question, if you are to play that game repeatedly, what strategies emerge? And he did a famous experiment where he asked a bunch of colleagues of his, invent various strategies and see which one wins. And very simple strategies ended up being the winning strategies. I've always been a bit critical of that experiment because it sort of assumes that there isn't a space of strategies where you can just enumerate the whole space and say, well, what are all possible strategies? What will win in the space of all possible strategies? In that case, you're just saying, well, what did my game theory colleagues come up with for strategies, which is a much less kind of, to my mind, scientifically and formally rigorous thing than to say, well, let's look at all possible strategies. Well, how do you look at all possible strategies? Well, if you're looking at all possible programs, maybe all possible Turing machines, some other model of programs, you can start asking these questions about all possible strategies. And actually, I looked at this, I don't know, sometime in the 1990s, of looking at enumerating all possible strategies represented as it happens with cellular automata. I never really pursued it very much, but it seemed to me that one could actually make a much more rigorous and formal theory of iterated games in that kind of way. And it actually occurs to me now, the work that I've done fairly recently on biological evolution has been very much one organism for itself, so to speak. It's like there's a fitness function and one is defining whether that organism, how that organism does with respect to the fitness function. Something I haven't looked at is when you have competitions between organisms, how does that play out? And as I think about it, just talking to you guys, I realize that that would be a very nice example of sort of a more formal version of something like iterated game theory, where your theory of iterated games, because what you could have there is instead of just one organism seeing how fit it's going to be, you would have sort of multiple organisms that were competing with each other. But by the fact that in this particular way of setting things up, one's really going all the way down to the underlying rules of the organism, one could, in this case, really look at this question of sort of the evolution of strategies in this competition between organisms. Actually, this is something that should be looked at. I should make a note of that and actually try and look at it. It's a good idea. All right, a little bit of that. Let's see. Oh boy. You guys are asking some things I don't know well, but Rat is asking, I wonder if the code by John Nash exists somewhere. It'd be interesting to read. I think it does. I think it was actually maybe published in the Mathematical Journal at one point. It's a good thing to look for. Let's see. Questions here about gosh. You ask about some things I don't really know much about. Let me see. You know, it's let me see. It's a complicated question here from Nahid about, is the world governed by randomness or by order? Gosh, this is a long topic. I'm not sure. Perhaps it's sort of, is the world a random place or is it a place that is determined in some way? You know, usually you say things are random when you can't tell what's going to happen in them. And randomness is sort of an admission of a lack of knowledge. And the question really is there a way in which one could know enough about the world to be able to say everything about what will happen in the world? Well, in our theory of physics, the answer is yes. There is an ultimate underlying reality, and it's this thing we call the ruliad, and it's this entangled limit of all possible computational processes. It's a unique object that represents all possible computational processes. Now, the thing is, in that object, there are many, many different possible paths of history. So you might say, well, how do we determine which one we get? Well, the answer is we determine which one we get by where we as observers of what's happening in the ruliad, where we are in the ruliad. It's just like saying sort of the particulars of what we observe in, let's say, the night sky or the weather depends on where we are on the earth. The rules of the weather are the same everywhere on the earth, but the particulars of what weather we observe depend on where we happen to be. And so it is with the ruliad, that the particulars of what we observe, the particular history we observe, depends on where we are in the ruliad. The physics, the laws of nature that are followed by what happens, those don't depend. Those are the same, at least for observers like us. But the particulars of what we observe depend on where we are. So when we say this particular process in quantum mechanics has this particular outcome, the way I think about that these days is that in this thing we call branchial space, the space of quantum branches, it is the case that our particular mind, our particular consciousness, is at a particular place in branchial space, just as we are at a particular place in physical space that affects what we see around us in physical space. Well, the reason that there is sort of anything to say about this is that, for example, we humans are all on this particular planet. We're not scattered, so far as anybody can tell, except in science fiction, we're not scattered throughout the universe, so to speak. We're on this particular planet. So we all kind of agree about lots of things about the way the universe is, because we're all nearby on this planet. And so it is, a bit more abstractly in branchial space, that the reason that we agree about what happens in this or that quantum experiment is because we're nearby in branchial space. So we're all kind of in this flock. We're all observing things together in branchial space. We could imagine another observer somewhere quite different in branchial space who will observe a different set of things happening. But so in the sense, there is no randomness at the very underlying level of the ruliad. That is a completely determined thing. It's as determined as any kind of mathematical statement or any of these types of things. It is something that is a formal necessity that works the way it works because it has to be that way. But the question of what particulars we observe within that sort of large-scale formal necessity, that depends on the chance of where we happen to be. Now, it's a funny kind of chance because it's not that, well, it's not that there's something that's sort of hidden from us. It's just that there's nothing ab initio that determines where we will be. It's just we are here and therefore we observe certain things. And that I think is sort of the origin of the apparent randomness that we see in nature, is because the question of where we are is something not abstractly determined. It's just something that is the way it is because we happen to be where we happen to be. So that's my view of sort of the origin of randomness. Now you could say, well, okay, if it's all determined, why can't we just figure out everything about what's going to happen? Well, the problem with that is the phenomenon of computational irreducibility, that just because you know the rules for something doesn't mean that you can jump ahead and say what will happen. It could be the case, and it often is the case, that you just have to follow those rules step by step to see what the system does. And I think that's what's happening throughout sort of the physical universe and throughout the ruliad, is that to know what is going to happen, you have to follow the rules to see what happens. Now, those rules completely determine what happens, but it's not as if you can jump ahead and say, okay, given that I've seen the way things are now, I can immediately jump. Kind of a Laplace's demon, has the problem of not only, even if it knows where everything is, where every molecule is, it still has this problem of computational irreducibility, which Laplace did not know about, in figuring out kind of what is going to happen in the future. And I think that's what, if you say, is the universe deterministic or not? The answer is, well, it is deterministic, but only to an infinitely capable kind of observer. And that infinitely capable observer cannot be implemented. That infinitely capable observer is not a thing that can exist within the ruliad. So from within the ruliad, you can't jump ahead in that way. There's a lot that is computationally irreducible, And therefore, a lot that might seem to us, quotes, random in the sense that we don't know what's going to happen, but it isn't because we are missing some information. It's because we haven't done the computation. We aren't able to do the computation to jump ahead and see what happens. So that's kind of my view of it's a somewhat nuanced view of determinism versus randomness. There is determinism, but you can't know the outcome because of computational irreducibility. There is determinism in the sense that there is the whole ruliad that is completely determined, but you can't know what part of the ruliad you happen to be in. You can't say in advance what part of the ruliad, or say on a theoretical basis what part of the ruliad you happen to be in. Let's see. Um, gosh. Posh asks, would you ever write a book to explain the history of the ruliad and our physics project? I actually wrote, when the physics project was launched nearly 5 years ago now, I wrote a fairly extensive piece about the history of the project that I don't think needs much updating except for the things that have happened subsequently. Although I did learn a little bit more about the prehistory of people's thinking about discrete space. And I hadn't realized how many of the sort of notable physicists of the early 20th century had been sure that space was discrete, but just hadn't been able to make that work in terms of the formalism that they had available at the time. I have tended to, in the things that I write, I have tended to try and put, usually at the end of the things I write about particular areas, whether it's about biological evolution or whether it's about proof ideas about mathematical proofs and so on. I have started putting these kind of personal backstory sections at the end of the things I write, on the grounds that if I don't, that information will just be lost forever. So I've tended to try and go back and write down what my, how did this thing that I just wrote, how did it come to be? And often there's a 30, 40-year backstory to it, where there's been sort of several pieces done at different times, and I've gradually learnt more to the point where I've been able to write whatever it is I'm writing now. Oh my gosh, you asked me about so many things. You're uh, uh, I have a pretty decent memory, as you guys have probably noticed by now, but sometimes there are quite a lot of challenges in what you ask here. I feel like I should be like a RAG-informed LLM, a retrieval augmented generation LLM, where some of these questions I should remind myself of some facts and then make sure that I don't miss a key part of the answer. But the ones that I'm mostly tackling here are ones where I think, at least, that I know the facts cold, so to speak. There's a question from Quantum here. Have you studied the history of cognitive neurological abilities of scientists throughout the ages, things like long-term memory, imagination, creativity, and so on? I suppose I could talk about some sort of attempts to understand what it is that makes scientists be great scientists or whatever. I have a friend, a journalist, whose first big break, sometime in the late 70s, I think, was finding what had happened to Einstein's brain. It was sequestered by some medical person for later study, and it didn't really get much studied, I think, in the end. But it's kind of like, was there something special about Albert Einstein's brain? Probably the answer is not really. I mean, not much. And people at different times have had different sort of correlates that they've tried to make for sort of what makes scientists be able to be great scientists. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, who was big in the whole world of sort of biometric kinds of things. This is in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Francis Galton, I think, was the one who really pushed for fingerprints and using, for police investigations, using fingerprints. He was also, I think, quite keen on phrenology, kind of head shape types of things. And also quite a lot of the work that he did sort of segued into the whole eugenics area of kind of the sort of correlates, the kind of genetic correlates of intellectual capability and other kinds of things, and the kind of forget natural selection for humans, let's just do artificial selection and breed the humans we want, which is a pretty bad idea and turned out to be a really horrifying idea in the early part of the 20th century. And that whole effort, which was quite prominent in the US actually, has become, sometimes it's known, sometimes it's not, something of an embarrassment for some of the academic organizations that kind of were big in the eugenics movement. But that was kind of a but Francis Galton had also studied questions like, based on all the scientists who become significant scientists, what could you say about certain aspects of, whether this finger is longer than that finger and so on, the biometric correlates of scientific success or whatever. I would say that my own observation from studying sort of the biographies of scientists, having had the good fortune of knowing a lot of people who've been successful in science, what can I say about that? The first thing is that the kind of storybook version of success in science, which is that it happens, which tends to be that it happens overnight, on this particular day, this particular person discovered this amazing thing. That is never the real story. The real story is typically a decade or more of kind of contextual buildup, of kind of getting a way of thinking about things. And then sometimes that way of thinking about things converges with an actual problem that can be solved and which people care about the solution to, and then something great happens. I mean, Albert Einstein's a good example of this. He kind of had developed, partly, I think, following Ludwig Boltzmann, kind of this sort of philosophical approach to thinking about problems in science, this sort of thinking about things in an almost a natural philosophy kind of way of just sort of imagine the thought experiment, what will happen. But he also had competence in sort of actually calculating things in mathematical physics and so on. In 1905, he had this great year where he did kind of relativity, special relativity, the photoelectric effect, the idea of photons, and also Brownian motion, kind of a core piece of statistical physics. Well, in 1904, I only learned this recently, he'd written some papers about the second law of thermodynamics, one of my own favorite topics, using sort of this philosophical thinking approach, but it didn't work in that case. That was actually very much of a follow-on to what Boltzmann had tried to do for many years, kind of reasoning his way through the second law. It didn't work for Einstein, and the papers he wrote in 1904 were really no good. And then in 1905, that approach did work spectacularly, and it kind of was transformative for a lot of directions in physics. But you see the same thing over and over again, that there's a way of thinking that gets developed, and then there is sometimes fruit to be picked based on that way of thinking. And also, I think many of us are sort of fated to have a certain kind of way of thinking that is natural for us. So for me, it's kind of I like to think about things in terms of very simple primitives, kind of break things down to very minimal rules. And then I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea that I can run those rules on a computer and that they'll do things I never expect. I was surprised by that when I first saw it in the early 1980s, but I've sort of gotten used to it over the decades, even though I'm still surprised, practically every week I'll do some computer experiment and I'll be like, I don't think this is going to do that, although I have some idea it's going to do that, otherwise I wouldn't have done the experiment. But then it surprises me. It does a thing I didn't expect. But, I think that if you look at different kind of scientists and what their kind of path to whatever success they have had, it tends to be this thing of build up the context, and then it's like there is something there for which you can apply that way of thinking. And sometimes you can very much find your own fate, because it's like, well, there's this way of thinking, what can this be applied to? And you realize, gosh, there's a thing you can apply it to that maybe was the thing that people hadn't thought about in a sort of formal scientific way before, but now with this way of thinking, you can approach that scientifically, and then lots of progress is made. I mean, I would say that the thing that I'll say over and over again is that the sort of it's the strategy of science that is much the greatest determiner of sort of scientific success rather than the mechanics of doing the science. The mechanics of doing the science is a necessary piece, but it's far from a sufficient piece. You know, it's pretty much impossible to do kind of leading edge physics without knowing a certain amount of mechanically about 20th century physics and about sort of how to do calculations in 20th century physics and so on. And I'd like to think about the tools like mathematical and Wolfram language that allow you to do those calculations. But I think that's sort of a necessary piece. But the piece that you also need is sort of the strategy of what should you study. You know, I was thinking just yesterday, actually, people sort of talk a lot about superintelligence and kind of, you know, what happens when the AIs, you know, will the AIs be the next generation of scientists and so on. And I've always thought this was kind of like whatever. And I realized why I've thought that and why maybe other people don't think that quite as much as I do, which is I've spent my life building the tools that let me, when I'm doing science, go from just an idea to the implementation of that idea as easily as possible. That's kind of one of the whole points of Wolfram language is if you can conceptualize something computationally, you've got the fastest path to implement it and see what the consequences of what you thought of actually are. And so for me, when I'm trying to do science, I realize, what am I actually spending my time doing? Well, I'm spending my time trying to figure out what should I do? What hypotheses do I have? What direction should I go in? For me, the actual doing of the mechanics of it has been very much minimized because I built Wolfram language and because I have that, other people have it too, to be able to go from the thing I think about to type. Now, 3 minutes later, I've got this picture on the screen and I'm seeing what the consequences of that thought were. And now it's up to me to go and figure out, well, what do I think about next? It's not, I'm kind of sitting there having defined a problem, and then I'm scratching my head for a long time, wondering how to solve the problem. Now, at a grander scale, there's definitely quite a bit of that, but at the scale of sort of the actual doing of the science, it's really to the point where I feel like, well, sometimes, you know, I'll try and do something that'll be kind of fiddly, and you know, there'll be bugs in the code I write and so on. With the notebook assistant that we brought out a couple of months ago, that's based on modern AI techniques plus a bunch of other computational techniques of ours, that's being further minimized. You know, there's a bug and I can't find it. Well, I ask the notebook assistant, or, I don't know how to do this kind of fiddly thing. I ask the notebook assistant. And it usually gives me a good idea about how to do it. Even if it doesn't absolutely slam dunk solve it, it's like, oh, I forgot that function. Oh, I forgot that way of doing something. That's a reasonable way to approach it. So for me, this kind of idea of, you know, the AIs are going to just get so far beyond what I can do at that level, it's like, well, but what will they do? What direction will they go? What question will they ask? That's the thing that I feel like by the time we have automated having asked the question, being able to answer it, we're still left in a very human situation about what questions do we want to ask. And certainly in the science that I try to do, it's like, well, you ask a question, you don't know the answer, otherwise, why are you asking the question? You get the answer, but it's quite easy to get the answer, but then that defines a new question, you keep going from there. And I feel like that's sort of the story of the symbiosis of automation with human activity, not only in doing science, but in other places as well, that sort of the automation makes it possible to get to the point where there are more choices to make, but the choices are by definition not makeable in some abstract way. Now, at some level, you could say, and this is not so relevant to research, the choices can be made by the norms of society. Kind of like, well, if you decide what are you going to do in this situation, it's like, do the average thing that society does. I'm not sure that's the best future, but that's something where, you know, the LLMs can sort of be looking at all the things people have written about this or that thing or whatever and say, well, typically what people do is blah, blah, blah. Of course, in research, that's exactly not what you want, because if it's typically people do well, when it's the machinery of doing the research, yes, that typically might be useful. You heat the test tube up typically to this temperature before you do this or that thing. But when it's let me figure out something new, well, this is what is the typical thing to have done. You're never going to get to something new from that. I will say that one thing that I'm planning on is, one of the questions is if there is something that is sort of hiding in the literature of science, some thematic question that you've now defined that thematic question, and a number of those have come out of our physics project. I know the thematic question, but I don't know where there might be that experiment in astrophysics or something that's relevant to my thematic question. And that's something that I hope the AIs can help me with. It's, back in the 1970s, I started using online database systems for searching scientific abstracts and so on. Super useful. You could go from, oh, there's this buzzword that I know. Now, where does that show up? Who's written papers about that and so on? But when it comes to themes, buzzwords aren't going to cut it. And so that's where the LLMs can potentially be helpful, and we'll see how well that goes. But I sort of thought it was an interesting observation that sort of, I wondered why are other people sort of more enthusiastic about we're going to make an AI scientist. And I think it's kind of because, as I said, I've spent my life trying to automate the steps. And so that's just not where I'm spending all my effort. I'm spending my effort trying to figure out what should the next thing I think about be, not how do I actually do the mechanics of the thing that I'm currently trying to figure out, so to speak. I mean, it's kind of like when it comes to, I don't know, learning math or something like this. If you're doing lots of hand calculation, that becomes the main thing you're doing is, oh, how do I do all this hand calculation? That's what I'm spending all my time on. And the question of, well, what do you do next? What's the big picture of what's happening? That's kind of minimized to nothing. I mean, the same thing has happened to some extent in software engineering, when people are sort of used to using low-level languages for things, and they are just like, well, my job is to take the spec and implement it, in Python or Java or whatever else. And the question of what the new spec should be is not my job. And so you see this phenomenon where with the tech that we built, it's much more directly, you go from the thing you're imagining to being able to implement it very quickly. That's good for the people whose way of thinking is about, well, I'll make the next spec, so to speak. That's good for them. It's not so good for people who see it as their job to just implement specs. I think if we are to look at what will be kind of squashed out by automation, that will be squashed out by automation. In a sense, it already has been with the tech that we've already built, and that's used in some parts of the world, but not as much as it should be in kind of low-level software engineering. It's sort of shocking the extent to which people are doing things that just, it's one line of language code. It's 500 lines and all sorts of libraries and incompatibilities and months of time in lower level systems, and but people still do the lower level thing. I don't know how long it will take for that to really transition. I know when assembly language was going out, I mean, when I first was using computers in the 1970s, assembly language was still kind of what you used if you really wanted to make a serious program. And I think, I don't know when that really went out, probably by the late 80s, early 90s, that was on its way out, I think. And maybe they stopped teaching assembly language to computer science students, I would guess in the early 2000s, maybe. It's let's see. There's a question from Wilo. Do scientists invent tools first and then look for a problem to use them on, or do they find a problem first and invent the tool to crack it? Interesting question. It's not always the same people who invent the tools and who use the tools. It's, I mean, story of my life, I've spent a lot of time building tools that millions of other people have used. I also happen to use those tools myself. But the fact that I use those tools myself is almost a factored feature from the building of those tools. But, if we look at history, well, I mean, back to old Albert Einstein again, the mathematical formalism that he used to build up general relativity, the theory of space-time, was was sort of mathematical technology that came from Bernard Riemann and other people studying the theory of tensors and differential geometry. He was absolutely just importing that into physics from somewhere else. Those have been pre-built tools. People are often surprised that tools get built in mathematics and then they get to be applicable in physics. Hasn't always happened. People will sometimes say, oh, it's amazing, these tools that get built in mathematics are always useful in physics. It's not true. I mean, famously, transfinite numbers have not really found, which were invented in the late 1800s, have not found application in physics at this time, although maybe I've found a few little corners of that that might be relevant. In fact, there's one I found recently that might finally, at t plus 140 years or something, be an application of transfinite numbers to physics. But I think this question of I've always felt that in terms of formal tools, like mathematical tools and so on, that there is a certain aesthetic that leads it to be likely that the thing is going to be applicable. In my own work, I've often studied simple programs, and I know that when the programs are clean enough, it's sort of inevitable that they get to have applications. It's sort of like there's going to be a minimal model for things, and if the thing you built is a very, very minimal model, it's going to have intersection with what can be used in practice. But I would say that if you look at science in general, there are definitely, well, it goes both ways. I mean, there are tool builders who build tools, and then those tools are subsequently used. There are people who are trying to solve particular problems in science. They're doing they're trying to solve some problem about development of organisms, and they realize they need to figure out some new way to sort of sample cells in organisms and so on. But I would say that there are definitely cases where the tools get built because you need them to do the science, but often the tools escape. They end up once a strong tool has been built, it overreaches what it was built for, typically. To tell a story from my own life, I first started working on making sort of computers do mathematical computation as a result of trying to study Feynman diagrams in particle physics back in the late 1970s. Well, the thing that I built, first SMP, then now Wolfram Language, is vastly overbuilt for that particular problem of Feynman diagrams in particle physics. Even though that was the original motivation, was build a tool for this purpose, the thing that got built up was, infinitely more powerful than and the effort to build that tool. I would say when a tool is built well, it usually outruns what it was originally built for. And ironically, I'm actually back now. Oh gosh, what is it? Nearly, well, not quite 50 years later, studying Feynman diagrams again within a very different way, but that's a different story. But in any case, so I mean, this question of, as I say, I think there are two different activities: tool building and sort of science solving, and they really live differently. And now it's interesting in terms of the kind of the incentive structure of science. Tool building is often not well incented in kind of at least the academic domain of science. It's viewed as something where, well, in particular domains of science, it's like you get brownie points for like solving a problem. You don't get brownie points for building a tool that will allow 1,000 problems or 100,000 problems to be solved potentially by other people. So it's actually sort of a bug in the incentive structure of academic science in the last century or so that happens, because in a sense, tools are much higher leverage typically than an individual problem being solved. Now, I will say there's another piece to this picture, which is, in addition to tools, machinery for doing things, and the question of, well, what are you going to study? There's another thing, which is the kind of paradigm in which you're thinking about things. How do you think about that? Do you think about it in computational terms? Do you think about it in terms of mathematical theorems? Do you think about it in terms of kind of intuition about the way things tend to work in biology and so on? that's a yet different kind of thing. And that's something where people who have intuition but not sort of the detailed strategy of solving things, that tends not to work that well. If you have the intuition and then you can actually, bring the ship home, so to speak, and actually concretely solve something, that can be really valuable. But if you're just sort of talking vaguely and philosophically about things, that tends to remain quite untethered. And it tends to have been the case. The history of that has not been particularly good, of just sort of imagining something philosophically, and perhaps you got it right. Perhaps you imagined it correctly, but it isn't tethered enough for other people to be able to see that that's what happened. And so that tends not to end terribly well. Let's see. Pauline is asking, what is your favorite age of science? I assume you mean in the history of science. I'm pretty happy with the span of time that I've lived my life in. This moment at which sort of computers are first applicable as aids to thought has been really powerful. It's been really exciting to see what happens when you go from sort of just pure kind of minimalized human thought to sort of leveraging that up with computers. So I guess I would say that in terms of I'm pretty happy, that I was born when I was, so to speak. Maybe the future will be even more exciting, but it's cool to be able to see these things go from nothing to something. I think if I were to ask about other periods of history in science, the period that was very fruitful and I find very interesting is the period, the late 1800s and first few decades of the 1900s. That was a time when sort of formalism in science was really taking off, when the idea of going from the specific case to the general formal case, the sort of theory of theories, so to speak, was really taking off. Now, I'm glad I wasn't doing that at that time, because what we can do now with computers as a way to kind of automate the formalization of formalism, so to speak, is just so unbelievably powerful to what existed compared to what existed at that time. I mean, people like Whitehead and Russell spent, I don't know, a decade or something doing their very formal treatment of sort of building up mathematics from the underpinnings of logic, kind of in some ways, kind of a show-off project where sort of, 1 + 1 = 2 was derived on page 200 or something based on these sort of very minimal logical primitives. But they did all of that by hand. Today, one would set up a program and just let it run. And one would be able to see all these things. And it means that all that human time is turned into pure computer time, and one gets to sort of leverage the whole thing up much further. So, I mean, I think it would have been very frustrating to be involved in science at a time, let's say in antiquity, where you could have all kinds of theories about science. Oh, maybe atoms exist and so on, and you had no idea if it was true. What's interesting to me now, for example, with our physics project, the kind of the picture of the universe and discrete space and all this kind of thing, I am really completely certain that it's the right story, partly because it fits in so well to all the stories that I've known from other places. But I feel like, yes, one should try and validate it experimentally. That will have an effect on the world. But in terms of my own, and it will be very interesting to see how to make those connections. But for my own kind of internal philosophical thinking, I'm past that already. I kind of know it works this way. So I suppose that, had I known how it would come out, so to speak, projecting back to antiquity, it might have been okay to be in Democritus's time or something, although I think it would have been frustrating. Now, you could say, well, it's frustrating today because all these things that we might wonder about, finding discreteness in space and so on, it could be that the experiments necessary to do that are like, yeah, in principle, one can imagine it, but on the path that we're on right now, it'll be 200 years before we might have the equipment to be able to do that. I don't know if that's how it's going to work. Let's see. I should wrap soon here, but Susie is asking, how did early mechanical computers like the Babbage engine influence modern computing? The history is not particularly good. They really didn't have much effect. What happened is when Babbage created his difference engine, which was essentially a way of automating, generating mathematical tables and printing them out at the end, it was a way of interpolating functions to be able to win against the French in generating books of tables and so on, because they were important for navigation, for artillery, and so on, and later for insurance companies like Babbage was involved in. But the idea was do this mathematical calculation and do it automatically with these mechanical devices. That Babbage implemented. His analytical engine, which would have been more like a universal computer, never got implemented. But the difference engine, there were many sort of follow-ons from that of progressively more progressive kind of mechanical computers. There have been mechanical computers, simpler mechanical computers back in the mid-1600s. But by Babbage's time, that had really been cleaned up. And what followed were progressively more efficient mechanical computers. When I was a kid, I used a mechanical computer. That was, it was you would turn this crank and it would line up numbers and so on. And you could put things in with cogs. It was sort of the alternative to using a slide rule. A slide rule was sort of the quick approximate calculation. If you wanted to get many digits, well, use a mechanical calculator. It's they disappeared. They went extinct very quickly after 1972 when calculators began to become widespread. But actually, the mechanical computer, it was gradually miniaturized. Actually, one of my kids has one of these, a Curta computer, which is about the size of, or how big? It's about that size, and it's a kind of a cylindrical thing, and it's a really quite sophisticated mechanical computer, miniaturized at that level, made somewhat exotically in Liechtenstein, and that sort of had finally gotten perfected right around the late 1960s, just about when electronic calculators were going to come in. So the Babbage engine did sort of lead through to those mechanical calculators. When Alan Turing was writing about these things, he used the phrase, and we could calculate it with a Brunswiger, which is kind of lost on us today, but that was a brand name for a type of mechanical calculator in Alan Turing's time. It's kind of like I could work it out on an IBM PC type thing, which might be somewhat lost on people today. PC probably wouldn't be lost, but IBM PC might be lost. But then but when it came to the creation of the first, electronic computers, there were first electromechanical computers that had sort of combined electrical switches with these mechanical devices, and then later sort of using vacuum tubes and so on, making things purely electronic without any moving parts. And so I suppose that the general thinking of how one would have kind of a sort of mechanical way of calculating sort of did segue through into the no moving parts electronic devices. The idea of universal computing was something which was a total mess in terms of its origins. I mean, the fact that I don't think Babbage himself really so much internalized kind of what you could do if you had a computer that could be programmed to do anything. Ada Lovelace, in the one thing she wrote about this, really did nail that idea of, as she put it sort of poetically, much as the Jacquard loom, which worked on punch cards, just like the Babbage machine was supposed to, can weave pictures of birds and flowers. So Ada wrote, the analytical engine will weave algebraical patterns, and by which she had in mind things she was talking about, solving the three-body problem in celestial mechanics. She was talking about algorithmic music generation. She was talking about mathematical calculations of various kinds. She kind of got the idea that once you had this universal computer, you really could compute anything. That was in the 1840s. Those ideas were very much lost. and they kind of came back to life again through the practicalities of the early computers that did come out of sort of the tradition of mechanical and electromechanical calculators. Things like John Nassau's computer, that was from the 1940 something, early 40s. Then the ENIAC computer, 1946. These are the first kind of stored program electronic computers, but they came from very much of an engineering tradition that I suppose really was the offshoot of the kind of electromechanical calculators from before. And the theoretical ideas of things like Turing machines and so on, they came, as I was mentioning, talking about John von Neumann earlier, they came only a bit later through kind of thinking about the sort of theoretical aspects of what we would now think of as neural nets, of kind of brain function and so on. And that kind of entered, and the sort of theoreticalization of computer science was a thing that was really a thing of the 1950s, 1960s. Before that, it was really solve the engineering problem of making a sort of a not many moving parts kind of thing that can do calculations a bit like these electromechanical calculators could do. Okay, Heidi asks the question, do you think Ada would have had more success in science and math today than she did when she was alive? I think so, but you never can know how things progress. I mean, you know, Ada was a lively character who had the misfortune of getting very sick in her 30s and died very young, and you know, that would perhaps have been different today. Although she died of cancer, although somewhat, yeah, she would have been unlikely to die in the same way that she did, as early as she did, with today's medicine. But in terms of, I mean, in Ada's time, you didn't like go to college. You know, she had various tutors. She got married quite young. You know, her husband had sort of access to the library of the Royal Society. You know, I'm afraid in those days, you know, Ada, it was like, you know, no women type story, which would be different today. I think you know, I think that Ada's skill was really a kind of seeing the big picture kind of skill. I mean, she originally thought of herself more as a potential expositor of science than a creator of new science. But it turned out in the particular area, and it would probably have been true in other areas as well, of what she was doing with Babbage. Babbage didn't understand the you know, he was very much down in the engineering details and not up in the big picture. You know, Ada Lovelace had sort of a bit modeled her potential career, which never came to pass because she died young, on Mary Somerville, who had been kind of for example, the translator of Laplace's works on celestial mechanics into English, and more of an interpreter and expositor of science than a primary, I'll figure things out for myself type scientist. But you know, it's always strange in some of those things because, and it relates to these questions about building tools, you know, all sorts of people back in those days ended up building tools that sort of transcended the uses that they had. Like I think Florence Nightingale, who was a friend of Ada Lovelace's actually, who was doing lots of early nursing work, invented, I think it was the pie chart, but a visualization method for data, which of course has had many, many uses beyond the particular uses that she may have put it to about figuring out sort of what was happening in outcomes and medical outcomes and so on. So it's, you know, I tend to think that an Ada today would have, you never can tell. You know, the personalities might have led to all kinds of things today. I mean, I will say that Ada at one point made a pitch to Charles Babbage to say, let her, Ada, be the CEO of kind of Analytical Engine Limited, which of course wasn't a company called Analytical Engine Limited, but might have been in more modern times, it would have been. She made a pitch, let her be the CEO and Charles Babbage be the CTO, because Charles Babbage just wasn't very good at getting things done at that level. And he initially completely rejected it and then said, well, maybe yes. But then Ada got sick and it never happened. So, I think Ada was off on the sort of had a bit of the entrepreneurial urge also. And so it's hard to know. It's these kind of alternative histories are hard to say, but I would have sort of imagining what an Ada put in today's world would have been like. I think I think there would have been she would have probably gone far, but you never can tell because there might have been, it might have been that if she'd been sort of in school doing the things she was supposed to do, she would have been too much of a free spirit and never made it past all those kind of gates. So it's hard to tell. It's hard to analyze the ultimate history. But I'm not sure that you might think sort of being a woman in science was disastrous at the time. I'm not sure it really was so much. I mean, yes, there were things that, she couldn't use the library at the Royal Society, which is just crazy, but, she got her husband to take the books out. So it's not, and in some ways, the fact that she wasn't part of the establishment might have helped her a bit because she was just like, I'll do whatever I feel like doing. And the things she felt like doing were more creative, perhaps, than what people who were like, I'm an establishment institutionalized scientist would feel that they should have done at that time. So I think it sort of cuts in both ways there. And I think that it is certainly true that the scientists she interacted with took her perfectly seriously. I mean, at the very beginning, when Ada was, I don't know, 15, 16 years old, when she first met Charles Babbage, who was at that point maybe 40-ish, he sort of assumed that she was a society kid who wasn't interested in anything serious and scientific. And he was had some sort of, I don't know what it was, some sculpture that he dressed up in different kinds of get-ups. And his first interaction with Ada after some event where they met was to tell Ada about sort of the different get-ups for this sculpture. And Ada was like, no, I'm not interested in that. Tell me about the math, more or less. And but he certainly adapted very quickly to that point of view. And certainly Ada knew many of the sort of leading scientists, whether it was the Michael Faradays of the time or the Charles Whetstones and so on. And they certainly took her perfectly seriously. It wasn't, I'm sure she had quite a strong personality, but it wasn't like, it wasn't like, oh, she's the wrong gender, we're not going to take her seriously. That wasn't, at least from what I could tell of that history, that wasn't something that was happening. All right, let's see. Well, maybe one more question and then should run along. Jamie is asking, would you say you research more of the history of people or the history of their projects and research? What do you find more useful? I research both of those things. I have found that if you really want to understand the flow of people's projects, you have to know something about the people themselves. And otherwise you get very confused about how did they jump from here to there? What did they know? It's all too easy to project back from what we know now onto some project that was done 150 years ago and say, oh, they were doing this and that, which we now understand. But you're completely wrong in that back projection. That's not at all what they understood. But to not make that mistake, you have to get some more of a sense of what those people were like as people, and what they knew. Like for example, let's take George Boole, who the inventor of Boolean algebra. It's like, what was he thinking of when he invented Boolean algebra? What did he know? Did he think very formally and logically? Did he think more about sort of the math of the time? The answer is he thought more about sort of the math of the time, which he knew decently well. He wasn't a super duper, top of the line math person. And in fact, that was a good thing because eventually he had to squiggle the laws of arithmetic to decide that it could really be okay that 1 + 1 = 1. which is the rule for or and true plus true or true is true. And he kind of translated that to 1 + 1 = 1, which in a sense, if he'd been more sort of mathematically, I mean, of course he knew that 1 + 1 wasn't equal to 1, but if he'd been more in line with the kind of official mathematics of the time, might have said, we can't squiggle it that way. So it's but you had to kind of know that what Boole did for a living and what that history was to get a sense of how he was thinking about those kinds of things. I mean, it's also for Ada Lovelace, it's also when you read these things about, the analytical engine weaves algebraical patterns, it's like that could just have been puffery. It could just have been something where she happened to say that. I mean, another thing I've been trying to track down recently, another thing from Ada actually, is she wrote in some letter at some point, I hope to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system. So she wrote that in about 1840. What did it mean? Had she figured out something that was kind of like neural nets of today? I don't think so. But what did that mean? To know what that meant, you had to know something about her, the people she was talking to, the kind of ambient culture of the time, and so on. And without that, it's very hard to interpret something like that. You might easily go from that statement and say, Ada invented neural nets, which I think is wrong. But knowing what she did mean by that is something that requires kind of a study of her and her environment to see what she was thinking at the time. I find that in some things about people turn out to be irrelevant. Some things about people turn out to be relevant. Even in doing history of things I've done myself, things that I thought were irrelevant turn out to be highly relevant when you understand them in terms of sort of the arc of history. I mean, it might have been the case. I thought for a long time that the work I had done in 1979 to 1981 on building my first big computer system, SMP, was irrelevant to the work that I did later on simple programs in the computational universe and so on. But I'm completely wrong in that assumption. It was critical to me that I was in a position to have known that you could kind of build things up from underlying primitives, which is what you do in building a computer system, and that made sense. What I had done previously in physics was much more to kind of drill down from the physical world to its underlying theory, rather than just invent a theory and build up, so to speak. And so the fact that I'd had this experience in a sense, very practical sort of building of tools, the kind of the paradigm that came from that was critical to understanding what to do in the sort of exploration of the computational universe. And I didn't realize that for decades after that had happened. So, but this kind of contextualization of what one was doing is, I think, pretty important to understand sort of where one was coming from in how one did what one did. I mean, I think that I've been studying the history of neural networks and the 1943 paper by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts, and I've been having quite a time trying to figure out where did that come from. Warren McCulloch was a dyed-in-the-wool neurophysiologist with some sort of philosophical overpinnings, so to speak. Walter Pitts was a kind of young sort of child prodigy type math logic type person who later got much more interested in was sort of interested in everything, but was interested in sort of how brains work and so on. And I, understanding that, it's like when McCulloch and Pitts were writing, let's make a neuron that looks like this. If you didn't know that Warren McCulloch had, recorded electrical activity from many neurons, and Walter Pitts that was interested in that, but was coming from the sort of pure mathematical side, it's very hard to understand what was actually going on in that effort. So it's important, I think, to understand both sides. It's also, for me, it's always it's always a puzzle to see how the pieces of both projects and people's lives fit together. And I suppose I find it interesting that, having done quite a lot of science projects myself, I have much more intuition for how science projects fit together. What is it like? What kind of steps can you actually take, and what kind of steps can you not take? what kind of steps could be hidden from view but have happened anyway, and what kinds of steps are completely implausible to be hidden from view. And you guarantee there'll be some place where you can see those steps if you look for them. And similarly, when it comes to people, it's, I've had the good fortune, I suppose, of knowing lots of people and being interested in people. And I always find it interesting to get sort of, what was the personality of this person? What are, perhaps even some little anecdotes that tell you things about people, the fact that Alan Turing had a very sort of high-pitched, strange little laugh is a thing that, it somehow informs a bit about kind of what he was like as a person, or the fact that Galileo was a fairly short stature fellow with bright red hair. Does it really matter to his science? No, it doesn't. But it gives kind of a picture, that Galileo was sort of he was a pugnacious fellow, and that has nothing to do with his appearance as such, but it gives you kind of more of a picture of how people will have reacted to him to understand those kinds of things. And I think it's often, or the fact that John von Neumann, was a very, he liked having these parties, and he ended up being kind of a very jocular fellow with a great love of party hats and so on. And that again sort of helps inform, when you start thinking about his work on game theory, or his work on kind of the Cold War and applying mathematics to the Cold War. It's a different type of person if he was a kind of a dour kind of sort of person than a person who was a sort of very lively, jocular type of person. I think, at least it helps me to understand, to not make mistakes, I suppose, in what kind of a thing might he have been thinking about. And sometimes with some people I try to study, it's hard to tell. Like with Warren McCulloch, for example, where I think I understand him much better now. I couldn't tell to what extent he was seriously mathematical, to what extent he was, really interested in experiments, to what extent he was really a philosopher. I now think I understand much more of that, and that really helps in contextualizing the work that he did. And so I find that interesting. It's just like, for me, as I deal with people in sort of today's world, it helps me to kind of be able to map some of the personality types onto things where we know what happened historically, and it's kind of, well, that's following the track of something. It's important in science prediction and in technology prediction to sort of have those models, and you can get those models from studying studying kind of where cases where the answer is now known. I often find it a little bit kind of I don't know, strange that I'll look at something where I had some interaction with somebody at the beginning of the 1980s, and it's like, I wonder what happened to that person. The story is now more or less told, and it's always interesting to sort of see how that works out. And did one correctly? Well, was one correctly able to guess what would happen to that area of science, that person's work, or whatever else? Well, we should probably wrap up there. And interesting questions. I will also say that in terms of the sort of telling stories of the arc of history, having the people in those stories is important for the absorption of those stories. The raw, this, that, this happened, this happened, this happened, is much more difficult to absorb. I mean, I know when I was a kid learning history, not very well, I learnt the history of the 1600s in England, I think 3 times because of, I don't know, schools, whatever else. I don't know what the details were. I didn't pay any attention, which is kind of a shame. But, what I was learning was the battle of this happened that date. The battle of this happened that date. It wasn't that exciting to, it would have been better if I'd known more about, the story and personality of Charles I or something. I think that would have been more engaging to me than, this is what happened in the English Civil War on this date, this date, this date of battles. And I think the same is true with scientific history, at least for me, and I think it's true for other people as well, that knowing sort of more of the kind of the color and the personal stories, we all react, I think, to personal stories. And I think that's a useful backbone to a lot of these stories of the history of science. And so that's another sort of motivation to know those personal stories. It's more interesting to know kind of not just, I mean, some of the scientists have had more interesting lives, more colorful lives than others, but to know something about those is something that I find helpful at least. All right, well, I should wrap up there. Thanks very much for joining me, and thanks for a lot of interesting, provocative, at least for me, questions. And I look forward to chatting with you another time. And I should give a pitch. I put out this book a number of years ago called Idea Makers, which is sort of a collection of essays that I wrote about particular scientists. About half of them are people I'd known, half of them are people I did not know. I think that's about the right fraction. And that tells a bunch of these kinds of stories and in more depth than I've been able to do here. Anyway, well, thanks for joining me. See you another time.